What happens when a Hollywood star and a sharp-tongued journalist clash live on air? Tonight, the curtain rises on a conflict that began before the eyes of millions and quickly escalated. This exclusive interview, pitting Margot Robbie against Piers Morgan, began as a mere interview. But by the time it ended, the audience was shifting in the studio seats, while Piers contemplated the most difficult decision of his career. The studio lights glared like thousands of eyes fixed on them. The atmosphere was bathed in an artificial glow tinged with tension. As the familiar title track faded, the camera began to zoom in on Piers Morgan. Piers adjusted his tie with quiet authority, then flashed his signature controlled smile. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back," he said in a soft but firm tone. "Tonight, my guest is Oscar-nominated actress, producer, and occasionally controversial figure, Margot Robbie." Polite applause echoed through the hall, but some anxious glances were visible among some of the audience. Margot, entering through stage left, looked as if she had walked off the screen in her pale champagne-toned silk blouse and perfectly fitted light blazer. As the light glided across the fabric, she smiled that elegant yet unflappable smile. Her eyes were clear, as if she knew something everyone else here didn't. Piers stood and held out his hand. "Thank you for being here." "Of course," Margot said, extending her hand and then sitting down gently. She crossed her legs gracefully. "It's always good to clarify things. People often seem to misunderstand me." Her voice was calm, almost melodic, but a subtle challenge quivered beneath it. This was just the beginning. Piers laughed softly. "So let's clear up some of that confusion tonight. Let's start with what everyone's been wondering. In recent years, you've moved away from guaranteed box office productions. It's as if you've abandoned the classic Hollywood starlet role. Have you ever regretted it, or was it inevitable?" Margot tilted her head slightly, winking. Her expression suggested she didn't think the question was creative enough. "If you'd been paying attention," she said calmly but icily, "you'd have noticed I prefer to create my own story than to shine on flashy posters." There was a subtle stir in the room. Some whispered, others smiled slyly. Piers continued, his professional expression intact. "So you're saying Hollywood is just a spectacle? What about art, responsibility, tradition?" Margot parted her lips and smiled slightly, mocking, confident. "When a woman is told to look pretty and given a script, it's a bit too generous to call it art. Dancing in the window of fame and being creative are two different things, Mr. Morgan." Piers scribbled something in his notes, then looked up again. "But this system has worked for centuries. Wasn't it the window that made you a star? Other actresses are still in this system. Aren't you being unfair to their hard work?" Margot straightened the sleeve of her jacket, a slight coldness appearing on her face. "I'm not being unfair to anyone. Everyone fights their own battles. Some people advance by obeying, others by resisting." A more distinct murmur rose from the room this time. Some found Margot brave, others rather arrogant. Piers continued, his tone unchanged. "And yet, thanks to that obedience, you won the hearts of millions, haven't you? Have you no gratitude? At least not to the system that gave you this platform?" Margot let out a short laugh. His smile was elegant but heartfelt. "The system?" he asked, his voice filled with a touch of sarcastic kindness. "I gave that system my youth, my sanity, and my own voice. In return, they wanted me to smile on the red carpet. Now I've taken it back. That voice belongs to me." This statement silenced the room. Piers narrowed his eyes, shook his head slightly, and continued. "Your sharp answers are remarkable. So let's move on to another question. Your relationship with the press. For you, the media are friends if they're useful to you, enemies if they're not. Some see this as opportunism. What do you think?" Margot leaned forward, her gaze locked with Piers's. "I'd say people confuse privacy with secrecy. But if you were mature enough to understand that, you wouldn't spend your career chasing scandal headlines." "Oh, wow," echoed from the room. Piers smiled, but his eyes were now intent. Margot sat back, her posture unwavering. The game had now really begun. "But still," Margot said, a barely concealed smile on the corners of her lips, "if you knew the difference between the private and the secret, You wouldn't have built your career on prying into people's lives. That sentence descended like a volleyball into the studio. A few people in the audience fidgeted. Some gasped involuntarily. Piers merely smiled slightly, a small spark burning in his eyes. "If you're sincere, Margot," he said calmly, "tonight promises to be very interesting." The atmosphere in the studio had shifted. The lights shone the same, but a different tension now quivered beneath them. The cracks that had been quietly surfacing were now growing visibly. Margot Robbie's controlled exterior, subtly challenged by Piers's steady, pointed questions, was beginning to crack for the first time. By the time the segment ended, not only Margot but the audience was uneasy. Some were unsure when to applaud, others unsure whether to roll their eyes or laugh. As the cameras rolled, Margot adjusted the collar of her jacket. Her smile was still on her face, but now it was tighter, sharper, a kind of shield. That elegant white blouse still glistened in the light, but the uneasiness rising within her could no longer be concealed. Piers leaned back in his chair, thumbing through his notes with deliberate slowness. Then raising his head, his gaze fixed on Margot, he spoke in a soft but clear tone. "Let's move on to another topic. Your personal life, or rather how the public perceives it. Your marriage, especially your relationship with a director, which has been much talked about in recent years, has generated considerable buzz in the industry. Some say that this relationship has changed you, that you've become more distant, angrier, more controlled. What do you think?" Margot's eyes narrowed slightly. Her response came in a tone dripping with honey, but concealing a hint of sting. "Oh, Piers, how sad. Being so fixated on someone else's marriage. Is there really that much emptiness in your own life? Are you still married? Are you happy?" There was a collective gasp from the audience. Piers raised an eyebrow, but his expression remained unchanged. "I'm quite happy, thank you. But this is a platform for your career and influence, not my personal mom." Margot pursed her lips again, a glint in her eyes, challenging, slightly condescending. "But of course it's not about me, is it? Because for people like you, women only have two roles, fragile victim or control freak witch. What a boring scenario." Piers leaned forward slightly. "We're here to discuss whether this is a script you wrote anyway." The studio wasn't just silent anymore. It was cold, and Margot Robbie was beginning to reveal the true woman behind the elegance. "Because people like you always need a bad girl to get ratings," Margot said, her voice sharp but still elegant. "How original?" Piers ignored the remark, raised an eyebrow slightly and glanced at his file. "Many industry critics say that since you've strayed your career from traditional acting, you've become more isolated, angrier, even more closed off, according to some. Do you feel responsible for this?" Margot let out a short, dry laugh. "Oh, do you really believe in gossip columns, Piers? Does a person become spoiled immediately after finding some peace? I'm sorry, but don't be disappointed if I don't follow your script." A few hesitant laughs were heard from the audience. Piers tilted his head, his tone remaining steady. "So, no regrets? Haven't you ever questioned how your relationships with those close to you, your family, your colleagues, have been affected by this process?" Margot's face hardened noticeably for the first time. "I don't sleep at night shedding tears for the people who turned their backs on me, especially those who only loved me as long as they were the shining star. Is that clear enough?" The audience was silent. Piers raised an eyebrow but didn't change his expression. "Quite clear. Let's move on to another topic then." She opened a new page in her file. "Your work with charities. Some critics say these projects are not sincere but PR-driven. There are those who claim they're just a window dressing for you. What do you think of that criticism?" Margot shifted her position from crossing her legs. She leaned back, raised her eyebrows slightly, and smiled. But the smile wasn't genuine, it was sharp and deliberate. "If the cameras aren't on me, they'll ask, 'Where did you go?' If they are, they'll accuse me of putting on a show. When it comes to me, I guess no matter what I do, I'm committing a crime." Piers nodded. Perhaps that's the price of being a public figure, the responsibility of being in the public eye. "And some would say," Margot began, her voice now cooler, sharper. Someone who doesn't know what sincerity looks like only reveals their own emptiness when they question someone else's sincerity. Mixed voices rose from the audience. Some were surprised, others annoyed. Piers interjected politely. "This is a family-friendly show, Margot." Margot waved her hand. Her smile returned, but this time more theatrical. "Okay, let's get on with our game, Mr. Morgan. We can continue pretending this is a friendly conversation." Piers bowed his head slightly, almost appreciatively. "You've said before that the industry has been cold, distant, even cruel at times towards you. But some team members working behind the scenes, sources who wish to remain anonymous, are accusing you of being difficult, demanding, even manipulative. What do you think of those comments?" Margot's smile, which had been etched on her face until then, faded. A sudden gleam appeared in her eyes. She was angry now, but she wasn't going to show it with words, but with shouts. "I'm saying, Margot said, her voice now thick with a trembling tension. "Those so-called sources need to find the courage to say what they're saying to me. Anonymity is easy. Cowardice is even easier." Even the cameramen were feeling uneasy behind the camera now. Eyes narrowed, shoulders tensed. The atmosphere in the studio had thickened. But Piers didn't back down. "But these comments aren't just from a few," he said, lowering his voice a little. "They're all saying the same thing. Could they all be wrong?" Margot's eyes narrowed and her voice suddenly sharpened. "No, they're all spewing anger, because I wasn't the silent beauty they'd like. They couldn't handle a woman who still had her own opinions when the cameras were off and wasn't acting behind the scenes." This time, Piers paused. He leaned forward, weighing the weight of his words. "And have you ever said to yourself, 'I made a mistake. Maybe I could have handled things differently'?" Margot blinked slowly, but her usual soft, starry smile wasn't on her face. Her voice was icy. "Of course, I made a mistake. It was my biggest mistake to assume you and others like you meant well." Someone audibly gasped from the front row of the studio. Margot's words echoed in the air. Wordlessly, Piers corrected his notes, raised his head, and spoke. "Margot," he said in a measured but clear tone, "maybe not royalty, but you've made it clear what you think of this industry, the media, and even the viewing public. But I have to ask you this, do you still care what the public thinks? Or is everything now just about Margot Robbie?" Margot smiled, her lips curling. It was a defiant smile. "I still care what some people think, but generally speaking, no, because the public has become an echo chamber judging me without even knowing me. And I no longer have to speak to that chamber." The audience shifted uncomfortably. Some turned their heads, others nudged their knees. A few nervous laughs rang out, but a silence hung in the center of the atmosphere. That was the feeling. Margot was no longer performing on stage. She was there, in her true, unfiltered form. Piers clasped his hands and leaned back in his chair. The muscle in his jaw tensed slightly. "Okay," he said softly. "Thank you for your honesty. At least it's been an educational evening." Even when the cameras cut to commercial, no one moved. Silence descended like a thick curtain over the room. It wasn't just an interview anymore, but a defense system disintegrating on live television. And as that defense system crumbled, both Margot and Piers became increasingly human. Everyone in the studio knew by now, this broadcast finale was not going to be ordinary. As the minutes dragged on, the tension in the studio intensified, almost to the touch. What had initially begun as a graceful interview had now become a battleground of egos and pride. The audience stood in shock amidst this clash. No one could move, unsure who was right and who was about to be crushed. When the cameras returned after the commercial break, Margot Robbie was still seated in the left corner of the stage. The collar of her crisp white silk blouse was still flawless, her blazer neatly adjusted. But her posture had changed. Her arms were crossed, her jaw clenched. Her eyes avoided Piers, focusing on the hall's overhead lights. This wasn't a program anymore. It was a battleground. The air in the studio was colder now. The applause had thinned. The audience no longer knew when to react, waiting with bated breath for the on-stage storm to erupt. Piers Morgan looked up with his familiar professional smile, but there was something else in his eyes now. Determination. perhaps the desire to strike the final blow. "Welcome back," he said in his usual soft voice. "Our guest is Margot Robbie. We're continuing to discuss her journey, her work, and her views on almost everything." Margot exhaled briefly through her nose. The smile she'd formed on her lips was on the surface, but it never reached her eyes. "I don't think there's much left to talk about," she said in a flat, almost dull tone. Piers cocked his head slightly to the side, adding that gentle sarcasm as he replied, "I think we're just getting started." There were a few forced laughs from the audience, then silence again. Piers leaned forward and glanced at his papers. "Let's talk a little more about your departure from the industry. You've said in the past that the fame that comes with big productions suffocates you. In some interviews, you've said you feel vulnerable. I want to ask, do you think the film industry is inherently flawed? Is it fundamentally rotten?" Margot uncrossed her legs and leaned back slightly. The light in her eyes this time wasn't one of patience, but of preparation for a counterattack. "Here we go again, aren't we?" she said, her voice now scathing. "It's always the same tactic. Dig, dig, the guilty party is found. That's your method." Piers remained unmoved. "That's not an accusation, Margot. It's a question." Margot rolled her eyes, then, not directly to the camera, pretended to speak to the audience. "What you call Hollywood, Piers, is nothing more than a showcase. No one sees what's inside. Marketability over talent, clicks over emotion. And I refuse to be one of the women slowly drowning in that showcase. So yes, I think this system is outdated, and it nearly destroyed me, but I didn't let it." The room went into a frenzy. Whispers, slight surprises, eye contact. Piers nodded slowly. It was crystal clear. With that statement, the room realized the interview had reached a breaking point. Margot wasn't just giving an interview. She was defending her existence. "I see," Piers said after a brief pause. "But have you ever considered, maybe, just maybe, that the problem isn't just the system, but your approach to it?" Margot's laugh this time wasn't soft, but sharp and eddery. "Ah, the classic method. Blame the woman. How original." "Not a blame," Piers said, maintaining his composure. "Just a thought. Haven't you ever taken responsibility for what happened?" Margot's old smile returned, but this time, cold. "Of course I have," he said, keeping his gaze steady. "I take responsibility for putting myself first in my life for the first time. And I understand that for you and half this country, this is still something that's hard to stomach." The audience began to shift in their seats. It was as if someone had cracked an invisible window, letting in a cold breeze. Piers didn't back down. "Now let's get to your media projects, podcast series, documentary deals, children's books. Some critics say these aren't meaningful work, but rather a personal rebranding effort. What do you think?" Margot's eyebrows raised slightly, the corners of her mouth quirking upward. "Critics always talk, don't they, Piers? If I stay silent, I'm passive. If I speak, I'm calculating. Maybe it's not me, but it's you who can't stomach a woman in power." Piers clasped his hands in front of him. He was still calm, but his eyes were sharper now. "Perhaps," he said in a low but clear voice, "the problem lies with those who confuse arrogance with a sense of control. Have you ever considered, could the critics be right?" Margot's laughter was bitter this time. "You want that, don't you? I'm here, live on air, shedding tears and screaming, 'Okay, I'm the bad girl. Sorry, Piers, someone else should play that scene.'" A disgruntled murmur rippled through the audience. Even a few camera operators working in the background caught each other's eye and then looked away. A kind of unsettling awareness was now circulating in the studio. Piers spoke without taking his gaze off Margot. "This isn't about being a bad or good character, Margot. This is a story about choices and consequences." Margot leaned forward, a hint of sarcasm on her lips. "Oh, how nice. You finally got me into the pose of a man old enough to give a life lesson, huh? The concept is brilliant. A moral lecture from post-scandal PR expert Piers Morgan." The room froze. A few people looked down in shame. Some of the smiles were on their faces, but they weren't genuine. The tension was now unbearable. A few shy laughs rose from the back rows of the audience, but the majority were as silent as stone. At this point, Piers offered a thin smile, his lips slightly curling. "I've had my share of meltdowns, of course," he said almost in a whisper. "But at least I didn't try to profit from the victim role like you." The sentence was spot on. Margot's eyes narrowed, the sting in her tone no longer concealed. "Wow, Dieter," he said quietly. "Do you really think you figured me out? An old man, with his last opportunity for a show, finally confronts a powerful woman and unleashes all his resentment. What a moment for you," Piers replied, clenching his jaw slightly. "I know exactly what this is, and it's not a lynching." Margot threw back her head and laughed, then spread her hands wide. "Really? Because it sounds like a modern version of a witch hunt. What's next? Are you going to throw me in the water and declare me innocent if I sink and guilty if I float?" This statement drew a loud gasp from the audience. Some audience members rolled their eyes, others shifted fidgetily. Piers actually paused for the first time. His eyelids drooped slowly, then he took a deep breath. His voice was soft but steely underneath. "You know," he said, locking eyes with Margot, "I came to this interview with the intention of having a truly honest conversation. I wanted to discuss your decisions, your journey, the legacy you'll leave behind. But frankly, I feel like I'm the only one here who cares about honesty. You're all about twisting things, sarcasm, and the same old 'I'm misunderstood' story." Margot crossed her arms, a hint of sarcasm etched onto her face. "Oh, please, save your smart aleck lectures for me. I'm not some broken woman here to cry on your shoulder. And isn't that your real concern? To unravel a woman, then present her broken self to the camera." The audience seemed to have forgotten how to breathe. As the camera zoomed in on Piers, he stood perfectly still. He tapped his fingers on the table once, the sound echoing through the studio. "Okay," he said in a calm but jarring tone. "We gave you every opportunity to explain yourself on this broadcast. And you really took advantage of that opportunity, because now everyone saw who you really were. And no, no one was surprised." Margot raised an eyebrow, her eyes sparkling. She leaned back in her chair, her expression almost triumphant. Piers bowed his head with just the slightest smile. "Let's take a break," he said quietly. And as the cameras cut to commercial, the final shot was the steely glint in her eyes. When the cameras resumed, the air in the studio felt heavy, as if lightning were about to strike. Margot remained seated, her arms crossed across her chest, her chin high, her face set in defiance. Piers, on the other hand, still appeared composed, but his eyes were now burning. What had begun as a well-planned interview had now descended into a slow demise, and no one in the studio would ever forget this moment. The red light on the cameras flashed again, and the audience erupted in faint applause. It wasn't support, it was a release of tension. Margot Robbie sat upright in her chair. She carefully straightened the sleeves of her blouse and tightened the collar of her jacket. Her chin was jutted. Her eyes were fixed on a point near the ceiling, trying not to lose control. Piers leaned forward slightly. His hands were clasped on the table. His famous smile was gone. In its place was a tight line across his lips. His voice was flat but weighty. "Welcome back," he said. "Our guest is Margot Robbie, and it seems the conversation we had planned for tonight has taken a different turn." Margot rolled her eyes noticeably. A few people in the audience groaned softly, and one person closed her eyes. "Oh, Piers, don't act surprised," he said, his voice filled with a sneer of derision. "That's exactly what you love, the 'look, I'm cornering a strong woman' show." Piers tilted his head slightly. "No, Margot. What I love is asking real questions and getting real answers. But apparently you don't have any." Margot curled her lips. "Maybe your questions aren't worth answering, huh?" There was a loud shift in the room. A cough was heard. Someone from behind muttered, "Wow." Piers took a deep breath, his eyes fixed on the floor. Then, maintaining eye contact, he spoke. "Okay, then let's try it again. You said you left the big studio systems before feeling suffocated and pressured. But did you ever think you knew from the start what you were getting into? Wasn't that responsibility as part of you? Didn't you make that choice?" Margot let out a short, dry laugh. "Ah, yes. The theme of a woman knowing her place is back again. How ordinary of you, Piers." Piers leaned slightly across the table this time. His voice was firm. It's not about the place, Margot. It's about responsibility. You say you're the architect of your own life. Good. So you've never made a mistake in the process of building it? Have you never been held accountable? Margot retorted quickly. Of course I did, because I didn't let that system destroy me, because I didn't let them force me into the mold of keep polite and quiet. Is that what bothers you? There was a vague stirring in the room. Some faces showed admiration, others discomfort, but everyone felt one thing in common. There was no going back now. Piers clenched his jaw, his eyelids drooping a little. He was preparing the final sentence. Okay, one last thing. A pause, their eyes met. Many people say, Margot Robbie is no longer the Margot she once was. She left her friends behind, her colleagues, her family, even her country. And all of this was your influence. Do you really have no regrets? In this loneliness, do you never look back at yourself? Margot, most people say you're lonely now. You've drifted apart from your old friends. You've parted ways with some of your colleagues. And some say it's all because of your obsession with control. Don't you feel any regret? Don't you ever look back at yourself? Margot's smile faltered this time. Her eyes hardened. Here we were, no longer an actor, but a person forced to defend herself. Piers, Harry is an adult. He's not under my control. He made his own decisions. But of course, for you, everything should be about a woman, because the truth bothers you. Men make choices sometimes too. And if that choice bothers you, you find a witch to blame. It just so happens that that witch is me, isn't it? Piers's face changed for the first time. His jaw clenched. His fingers tapped the table once. I didn't say that, he said firmly. But you're so defensive, Margot. Margot leaned forward, her voice now sneering, high-pitched, and threatening. Defensive, though? No, Piers. I'm simply saying I don't have to explain my marriage, my life, and my choices to you. What happened? Are you jealous? Are you uncomfortable because the cameras are now on me? There was a collective shock in the studio. The audience barely breathed. Piers' eyes widened for a moment. Then he straightened up, took his hands off the table, and slowly stood up. His tone was icy. No, he said, it's not jealousy I'm exhausted from. It's patience I'm exhausted from. Margot's smile faded for a moment. She too realized what she'd encountered, but she didn't back down. She calmly adjusted her collar. Piers continued speaking. You came here. You took the chance to express yourself on this platform watched by millions. And what did you do? You became condescending. You became arrogant. And you openly insulted not just me, but everyone who watches us. Margot opened her mouth, but Piers raised his hand. Leave, no need. I've spoken to prime ministers, queens, Nobel laureates. We've had our disagreements, but they all acted like adults. You? You thought this studio was your own Instagram page. You thought you could control every word, every angle, every perception. The audience was completely silent, eyes locked on the stage. You want to play the victim? You can. You like being the misunderstood hero? Go ahead. But not here. I will no longer allow you to insult my profession, my audience, and my intelligence on this show. You can leave. That sentence hit the audience like a thunderbolt. Margot's eyes lit up. For a moment, she looked as if she were about to reply. Then she simply laughed. With a cold, slow laugh, she pulled out her microphone. She stood up. Okay, she said, straightening her jacket. Now everyone's seen the real Piers Morgan. Small, angry, predictable. After a heartbeat of silence, Piers replied, and now everyone's seen the real Margot Robbie. Arrogant, in love with herself. And worst of all, boring. The hall erupted in a roar. Margot's face contorted. There wasn't anger in her eyes, it was disappointment. She turned away without a word. She walked away with slow, deliberate steps. The click of heels filled the studio. The cameras followed her behind the curtain. The sound of the door closing echoed like the final act of a scene. Piers straightened his jacket, he sat down in a chair, and he looked directly into the camera. Ladies and gentlemen, I think what happened tonight speaks for itself. We'll be back after commercials. Before the screen went black, the studio shook with shocked applause rising from the explosive silence.